Welcome back to Gale Force Wins Season 4.
The Gale Force Winds podcast is proudly sponsored by the Newfoundland and Labrador Construction Association. The NLCA provides unparalleled opportunities for its members through industry education, construction information, government advocacy, and networking events. The NLCA is building Newfoundland and Labrador. For more information, visit nlca.ca.
Good morning. My name is Kristina Ennis, and we are here for a very special episode of Gale Force Wins. So I'm super happy to be here guest hosting this morning. Thank you so much to Jerry and Alan for having me. And I'm here this morning with two very special guests, Courtney and Gillian. And we will kick things off here with some introductions. How about that? So Courtney, if you'd like to start us off maybe and introduce yourself.
Yes, absolutely. So very happy to be here. My name is Courtney Clarke, she, her. I'm originally from Petty Harbour, Maddox Cove, and I am currently the Senior Manager of Education for Equal Voice National, which basically means I travel the country teaching women how to run for elections. And I'm also in my 6th year as a elected director for the Newfoundland and Labrador Credit Union, as well as my 2nd year appointed to the Provincial Advisory Council on the Status of Women.
Excellent. Not busy at all, are you?
No, not at all.
No. Right. And Jill?
So my name is Gillian Pearson. I am currently the Director of Client Relations and Corporate Communications at Robot Interactive and Marketing, which is a local boutique marketing agency. I am the former co-chair of the provincial chapter of Equal Voice, so I'm very happy to say that I've known Courtney for a while, and she's doing incredible work nationally now, bringing campaign schools all across the country. I just recently got elected to the Energy NL board, and I'm really excited to take on that work. And my background is mainly in policy and communications and advocacy.
Excellent. Also someone who's definitely not very busy, right? Yeah, not at all. So I am really looking forward to our conversation here this morning, and I would really love for us to kind of get into a bit more of a chat around the intersection of working in the private sector, but also being involved in community work, particularly around gender-based advocacy as well. So I guess my first question for you ladies would be, what got you interested in becoming involved in gender advocacy, but also other community work that you're both involved in?
You can go first.
So my first foray, I guess, into more public community work and advocacy was in 2018, 2019. I had just had my 2nd child, and because of my employment at the time, I didn't have a permanent position, and I ended up going back to work early. And that's when I really discovered how problematic the childcare landscape was in the province. And several years later, the environment is still very challenging for new parents out there.
Yeah.
So I got involved. I started a group called Parents for Affordable Childcare. And I remember talking to my cousin and being like, I'm going to start this online group. It might only be you and I in it, and there may not be anyone else. And it rapidly grew, and we became a public voice for quite some time about addressing a lot of the childcare issues here in the province. And that kind of led to an opportunity to run in my home district provincially. And I was able to use that opportunity to continue to identify and highlight the issues that disproportionately affected women in our community. So not just the absence of affordable and available childcare options, but a whole host of issues that really could have used more robust gender-based analysis in the province.
Absolutely. That is, I'm a member of the Parents for Affordable Childcare group on Facebook. I am not a parent, but I do work in the HR space, and it's something that affects so many businesses. It affects, the families, but also employers, and we've been facing a labor shortage in so many sectors.
And so I'd like to just give a shout out to a new group. It's called ABCs and ECEs, and it's a local group of parents who are continuing to carry the torch and keep the pressure in the advocacy space on local decision makers for childcare in the province.
Excellent.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, first off, thank you for the work that you do, because a lot of the childcare advocacy that you do has inspired me to look further into that in the political realm, because we see a lot of similarities that cross over. And for me, my launch into advocacy, especially gender-based advocacy, comes from being a survivor of gender-based violence. And I really had to take a step back and, I guess, rehabilitate myself when I went through what I went through. But what I came to realize was, like, I faced a lot of barriers in getting the support that I needed legally, mental health wise. But when I got those resources, I still realized that I had a lot more privilege than the people who were around me, in that I'm in the capital city where there are the most mental health resources. I had transportation. I had a male boss that supported what I went through. I had good insurance. These were things that other people didn't have, and meant that I got in maybe twice as fast as others.
Right.
And that really inspired me to get into the violence prevention realm. I became the chair of violence prevention Avalon East. We did a lot of work during COVID-19, getting people out of homes where they were isolated with abusers. And ultimately, a lot of that foundation led to the Transition House Provincial Domestic Abuse Hotline. And as I was doing that work, I was meeting all of these, like, phenomenal community leaders that were filling in the gaps that government should have been filling and closing.
Yeah.
And I was just so inspired by the way that especially women and gender diverse folks mobilized to help keep the community going. And I just started thinking, why are they filling in the gaps when they should be in the legislature closing those gaps?
Right.
And that's really what turned me to women and gender diversity in politics, and how I ended up with Equal Voice.
Cool. And the campaign colleges that you've been facilitating kind of across the country.
Yeah.
I've got an opportunity to participate in them as a guest speaker, and it's been really inspiring being around those tables and getting to hear the experiences that women are having. And I'm going to circle back to something Gillian said a moment ago about GBA Plus. We will circle back to that. But before we do, I'd love to know also how your community work and advocacy in particular, how that has benefited you as an employee in the private sector, and what benefits you feel that has brought to your professional life, but also perhaps your personal life.
So I think in the advocacy space, obviously, you get to meet a lot of people. You get to expand your knowledge on really important issues in your local community. And one part of it is that you do get a lot of practice in terms of research and writing your arguments, because in advocacy, you do a fair amount of media. So you get to work with a ton of local journalists who have a vested interest in helping you advance the issues that you're passionate about. And I feel like those soft skills in terms of, like, interpersonal dynamics, communications, speaking off the cuff, those are transferable in almost any workplace. So as challenging and isolating as advocacy can be sometimes, the skills that you gain in terms of advancing your cause and communicating those issues are very valuable elsewhere.
Yeah. Excellent.
I would echo that. I would say, a lot of the stuff that, especially in the community now with the campaign schools, where you're teaching about, embracing your backstory, know your why, like hard communication skills with traditional media, social media, fundraising, budgeting. Running a campaign is akin to being a project manager or running like a pop-up temporary business. So there are so many transferable skills, and there are so many people who have gone through these programs, and whether they ran or not, whether they ran and lost, the skills that they had ended up propelling their careers so much further because they were able to raise their profile, meet new networks. And some of the greatest people I have ever met, including the both of you, come from community. And, that is what sustains the advocacy in those hardest moments, are the people that you have around you.
I love what you just said about knowing your why, and it's something I really enjoy talking about too. anyone who's happy to listen for a few minutes. But that's something that you really see in the workplace now too, with changing demographics, with younger generations in particular. But I feel like it's almost trickling up in a good way, that people want to be working somewhere that they are making a positive impact. And that doesn't need to be necessarily very obvious or direct, but in your role, feeling like you're contributing to something positive and that is beneficial. So I feel like that's a really interesting area that a lot of people involved in community or volunteer work in general, they have their why of why they want to give back to the community, but that's definitely trickling into the workplace a lot more as well, which I very much enjoy. And it's nice when people enjoy what they're doing in their jobs. So I would love to circle back to GBA Plus. Would one of you like to throw us out a high-level overview of what that term GBA Plus means? There's probably a lot of people who either have never heard it or have heard it and have no idea what it means, or what its opportunity is, I guess I'll say. So GBA Plus, let's give us a quick and dirty definition of that.
I guess, I mean, if you want to add anything to this after, but it's a process that's in place across, public institutions that ensures any policies, programming that you're putting through is also coming from the lens of gender equity, of intersectionality. So those compounding effects of, I'm not just a woman, but I am a straight passing woman. So what are the privileges of that?
Right.
Having an invisible disability, if you have someone who's a new Canadian, how do all of those things kind of interconnect to create barriers or opportunities for improvement? So it's just making sure that politicians and policymakers are looking at it from a vast lens and not just from their own bias.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I mean, it's definitely a process that is in place that people are probably most familiar with at the government level, because government has been a driver of putting a formal process in place that they can apply and use for all different kinds of decision making, both public and internally. But there's a huge use for gender-based analysis plus in the private industry and community as well.
Yeah.
And we don't necessarily see that structured as kind of openly and clearly as we do in public institutions. And so my sister-in-law a few years ago, she was complaining about the parental spaces for people with young children on parking lots, for example, sometimes are really far from the cart corrals. And I told her, I was like, that is a perfect example of private industry, and probably not maliciously, but not actively applying gender-based analysis, right? So you can apply it to all sorts of situations to make sure that you are considering the needs of different people, to make sure that their experience is the best it can be, and that you aren't unintentionally making it more difficult for them to access your space or use your service or whatever.
And that really reminds me of another thing. I remember there was a business that, they were really proud that they had got a ramp installed to make it more accessible, and great. But what they did was they painted all of these weird designs and made it really dizzying. So people who have visual impairment, who might have, some sort of balance disorders, it would actually make it way more difficult for them to get into the building. So it's not even just looking at, gender-based things, intersectionality, but the subsections, the subsections within disability in that case is, it's more than just a ramp. You have to look at the full decisions you are making, because, now people with wheelchairs can get in the building, but now people who might have those balance disorders or visual impairments are going to have a harder time.
Yeah, and that's something that there's different community organizations who can help employers. They specifically exist to help employers navigate these sorts of decisions. There's resources available to implement them in workplaces as well. Inclusion NL,
love them,
is one of them.
Empower.
Shout out to Inclusion NL and Empower.
Kathy Hawkins is phenomenal.
Yep. Big shout out.
Big shout out to Kathy.
maybe
she'd be a good
chat with Kathy another day. One of you mentioned, I think Courtney, you mentioned policymakers. When it comes to decision making, leadership, in my opinion, is more of a mindset. It's not a title.
Yeah.
It's not a promotion that you get. It's not a job you apply for. And when we say the word policy maker, in the business context, do you have any ideas, or have you seen any kind of creative ways that people who wouldn't be considered necessarily leaders in an organization can have influence on implementing diversity and inclusion initiatives? Have you seen any of those? Anything like that?
So I know, like at Robot specifically, we obviously have a lot of kind of informal dynamics, informal processes. But it's really not a top-down leadership structure. Like, we really work on consensus. Obviously, we have like different roles and responsibilities, but it's very lateral, and that encourages a culture where you are encouraging people to weigh in effectively and equally, because they don't feel like they're existing within this hierarchy where
Right.
they don't have access to influence decision making. So, having an open culture in your workforce that is less traditionally like hierarchical. I mean, like, sure, in terms of structure and makeup of your organization, like some of that is necessary, but in terms of like the actual environment that you're operating in, that's a really big way to give entry level or mid-career people the opportunity to feel like they can contribute and apply those like leadership principles that we often assign or perceive from people like at the top with the formal title.
Right.
Yeah, and I would add to that, there are some opportunities just thinking top down for people that want to start doing that kind of work. It's imperative that you're getting, bias training to understand what your biases are, to create mentorship programs. Being on the board of the Newfoundland and Labrador Credit Union, the NLCU, they specifically were recruiting for younger people. And that is what got me involved. And being at those tables and them allowing me to voice my opinions in a safe and brave way, and embracing them, because I'm bringing conversations to them that weren't being had around the housing crisis, the childcare crisis, and what can an organization who's provincially regulated, that it has a mandate to the province and has 20,000 members and almost $1 billion in assets, what can we be doing that the big banks aren't looking at? So they're another example of just a phenomenal organization that puts people over profit and looks at removing those biases, and the CEO is on the ground everywhere that you go.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that is absolutely true.
And Courtney will tell you, just because of, different historical, like socioeconomic dynamics, when it comes to approaching or being interested in leadership positions, men typically will raise their hand. They will seek those opportunities out themselves. Whereas women and a lot of other marginalized communities, they are generally socialized to access those opportunities, if they even do have access to them, in many different ways. So having an organization, like having those policies or making that concerted effort to, bake in, rules and regulations where they are actively seeking out different voices, that's how you can get different perspectives involved. Because if you're just depending on people to raise their hand and be that leader, you're not going to necessarily get that diversity of enthusiasm that you are hoping.
Yeah.
I find a great way to really infuse confidence, especially in women and equity deserving groups, is in meetings rotating certain responsibilities, because you'll often find it ends up being the woman employee that gets the waters and the snacks and is writing the notes. You need to have okay, this week John's doing it, this week Kelly's doing it, but also having a conversation minor, a person who is just looking around the room to see who's not talking, and having that responsibility in that meeting to say, oh, I just noticed, Julie, you haven't really spoken up. What are your thoughts on that? And having that person with that responsibility just makes people more mindful of who's talking more, who's talking less, and even just coming in and asking, how are you coming into this space today, to add in context so you have an idea of where people are at, so you're having safer and braver conversation spaces.
I love that example of meetings and kind of being open and very upfront about everyone's role and responsibility around the table, but how you're feeling that day, or getting to know each other around those decision-making tables as well is really valuable. And I think those targeted initiatives to be a little bit more inclusive, but also explaining why you're doing it at the same time. There's a lot of varying levels of knowledge about these topics. And I had someone did a training session with a group, I think it was about 2 years ago now, and I had a man who had retired probably 15 years earlier, and it was a diversity and inclusion kind of 101 session. And he said to me, "Thank you so much for," I think he said, "dumbing this down." I said, "We're not dumbing it down, it's introductory." But he said, "Thank you for really bringing it back to basics and explaining this as if nobody in the room has ever heard any of this terminology before." And he shared with me that he felt that he had been excluded from these types of conversations, or assumptions had been made that he didn't necessarily care about diversity and inclusion, but he felt unable and unequipped to actually participate in the conversations. He didn't understand the terminology. He hadn't been around those spaces, and he said when he was at work, it wasn't something that was prominently discussed like it is now. So I think those opportunities, Campaign College is a great example of that, bringing that knowledge out and mobilizing that knowledge. I know, Jilly, you are very passionate about knowledge mobilization, and there's so many different ways that can be accomplished. And yeah,
I love that example because, it's about meeting people where they're at. And we talk about this when we're teaching people about giving your key messages. And, that's not just for politics. It's how you're communicating in the business world and in your advocacy. You need to have consistent messaging, but you need to meet people where they're at to be able to scale it, because people are at different levels of engagement and education. And if you meet them where they're at and provide them the space where they also know that they can make mistakes as they're learning, they're much more open. They're not on the defensive. They are being more open to be able to learn these things and start applying it to their real life.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And what was I going to say?
And I think that's a really good point as well, because, and especially in the advocacy space, because you have so many passionate people who have a vested interest in, addressing the issues at hand, at advancing equity and opportunity. We often sometimes stumble and expect perfection from people who may have been from different backgrounds or different generations, and they haven't had as much exposure to these principles and ideas. And often people have to become accustomed to the expectations of the next generation over time. And, obviously you want to hold people accountable, and you want people to move forward in the way that they navigate and understand the world. But like Courtney said, there also has to be a level of meeting someone where they are, such that everyone can, work towards the same goals. Because I find, when you talk to someone, you have a lot more in common, and you're a lot closer on an issue than you are further apart.
Right.
Yeah, always find that common ground, and it's so much easier to start from there.
Yeah, it's almost like a branding exercise. Like, maybe branding's not the right word, but an initiative to get someone on your side and understand where you're coming from and get that buy-in, which maybe it is. It's kind of a little bit of a marketing exercise, but kind of anywhere, if you're going to roll out a new project or initiative, it might be brand new to some people. It might be something other people have been aware of or knowledgeable about for years and years. But you might walk into any room at any given time and really have to kind of go back to basics. And working at a marketing company and launching new brands and things like that. And kind of doing that research and analysis of, the how and the when and the where, I think is important around kind of getting this GBA Plus concept into more of a business context.
Yeah. And I think also that when you have particular goals in mind, and maybe it's systems change, like introducing gender-based analysis plus, or ensuring that there are policies developed that encourage more equity or transparency or accountability, whatever it is, you do have to decide realistically. Do you want to use a blunt instrument in your journey to this goal, or is something a little softer more appropriate? And, women, like, they do struggle with this because, I certainly do not want to advocate for women to refine or hold back. But again, it just goes back to like meeting people where you are and say, like, how can I not compromise what I want to achieve here, but do it in a way that ensures that we're actually going to be able to do it and not face a lot of resistance. So that can be a tricky dynamic. And in politics specifically, I know that dynamic often exists. It's not like this outward resistance, but often it's, systems that are in place or rules and regulations that are in place, and that doesn't help advance the cause. And it takes a lot of work and dismantling of attitudes over time to help that versus, knocking someone over the head with something.
It's employee resource groups is something that I've noticed working for a global company in the oil and gas sector where diversity, inclusion, supplier diversity as well is very embedded, in part from legislative requirements. For example, here locally, the Atlantic Accord requires diversity and inclusion to be part of the benefits plans that operators are required to follow. But I've come to realize, working with smaller businesses the last few years, that is not common everywhere. And a lot of the barriers to smaller businesses kind of tackling this, even if they really want to and care about it, is they're not quite sure where to start. And partnerships in the community, collaboration opportunities with other businesses or, not-for-profit organizations or volunteer groups, there's lots of opportunity for smaller organizations to engage in this work without it taking away from kind of your day-to-day operations, and then kind of layering on how doing this work can actually improve your maybe productivity or profitability or revenue generation activities by engaging in these types of projects. So is there any, do you have any examples of any partnerships that you've seen or been a part of that have kind of elevated both organizations, maybe a volunteer group and a business, who've come together to do something positive around diversity and inclusion?
I guess this is more of a political example, but Equal Voice does a lot of partnerships with different levels of government to make it more equitable. So, for example, we just recently finished a sexual harassment legislation overhaul report with Justice Canada, and we've been able to dramatically reform sexual harassment legislation both at Newfoundland and Labrador, in the Yukon. We're hitting up all the different provinces and territories. We were part of helping the federal government implement hybrid parliamentary structures, and on May 28th, we're helping municipal people. We have a webinar May 28th on how to have hybrid municipal structures. And what this does is it doesn't just benefit women, but when we were able to get that federal hybrid piece done, it meant that several women across all parties who had babies months after that were still able to vote on important issues while being at home with their child and having parental leave. And if you get sick, MP Yvonne Jones was still able to make important votes while dealing with breast cancer. By giving these options, you still get the productivity and you also get added loyalty. So, retention is a lot more cost savings than, high turnover. So if you're having these little benefits here and there and you're showing that you actually care about not just their employee, like as an employee, their productivity, but how they're able to show up to work, they're going to stick around a lot longer.
No, that's true. You just mentioned municipalities, and back in the fall at the MNL conference here in St. John's, I was lucky enough to sit in a session with hosted by Courtney and Constanza with Task Force NL.
Yes.
And they had developed a toolkit actually to help municipalities who are pretty slim on their human capital resources to be able to roll out some of these larger initiatives, but there's been consistent challenges in rural areas with rural economic development, and there's lots of regional economic development work going on around the province very organically in the absence of a more formalized regionalization model. But they had developed a toolkit for municipalities to go out into their communities, talk with businesses, and try and fill those gaps. So one of the areas, housing. Housing is a big problem. I might have the best business idea ever, and I might have all of the tools to set it up, but if I cannot staff that business appropriately, kind of setting yourself up for failure. So I loved one of the examples was to kind of go out, and home care is also a big issue in a lot of rural communities as well. Is there an opportunity for someone who is elderly and might need some home care but maybe not all the time, maybe it's just with meals, or maybe they don't have anyone to shovel in the winter or help them in that way. Maybe they could take on kind of a roommate, someone to board with them essentially, but the municipalities kind of being that connector to solve those problems, which thought that was a really creative thing that they had put together for municipalities to really get going on that work.
That reminds me of an example, Van City Credit Union in Vancouver. Vancouver was having an issue with first responders crises, where people who were first responders, they could not afford to live in Vancouver, so they could not get first responders. So if a crisis happens, there's nobody in ambulances to come pick you up. So, and we see that here too sometimes.
We do.
And what they did was they actually created a lower interest loan mortgage program that would allow it to become affordable for EMTs to then live in the city and be able to get work there. And by just doing this one business decision, they were able to make a huge dent in the first responder crisis.
Cool.
And that's another example of the plus, in GVA plus, is we don't often consider rural versus urban a particular dynamic or a particular piece that has to be addressed or given special consideration. So in childcare policy as well, there have been a number of regions, especially in Europe, who have started to award these responsibilities to regions or municipalities to figure out their childcare shortages and supplies on a regional level, because provincial or national governments, they don't necessarily have their finger on the pulse, or it would take a lot more resources for them to figure out what buildings in small communities might be most suitable for childcare infrastructure, for example. And so when you have decision makers that are, far removed from situations that might be better addressed by local decision makers, then decision making becomes much more effective, efficient, and a lot of these decisions involve taxpayer money. Wouldn't you want to have a process in place, or put that effort in up front to say, like, how best should we solve this? And maybe it's not us. Relinquish some of that control so that this money is spent more effectively by people who are closer to the problem.
That's a great example too.
That's a side note. I have this ultimate dream with the rise of cooperative structures in Newfoundland and Labrador, of industries or credit unions or just like-minded groups just coming together and collaborating on a cause to create a childcare cooperative for their members, for their employees, finding ways to employ at livable wages, ECEs, just out-of-the-box solutions that are still localized, and again, it's going to create retention in your industry with your employers, and it just shows that you care and that you're listening.
That reminds me of the collaboration piece. It's interesting, and it's definitely organically popping up all across the province. The Economic Developers Association of Newfoundland and Labrador, amazing organization. If anyone's interested about anything that we have talked about here in the last half hour, that is an amazing organization to get involved with. It's a collection of, I would say, the most enthusiastic individuals who care about the sustainability of Newfoundland and Labrador that I've ever met. But the fact that it's all of these brains in the same room, physically or virtually, who just want Newfoundland and Labrador to thrive is just magical and amazing, and there's some really cool things happening. But the Southern Shore Joint Council, I think there's some joint councils who are coming together to collaborate throughout the province, but the Southern Shore in particular, I'm most familiar with their joint council, and they meet regularly. They talk about these collaboration opportunities to bring value to their community, and in turn, that will then positively impact their economic development and make the Southern Shore even more sustainable than it already is. And I'd love to see that kind of across the province, and just, I guess, that intersection between the business communities and differentiating between urban and rural, and how different jurisdictions of decision making can impact that. I like your dream.
Thank you.
It sounds
one
like
of many.
excellent dream. Okay, I have 2 more pointed questions for you ladies before we wrap up here this morning, and I'll start with, in my opinion, the harder of the 2. So I love asking people this question. What do you find most challenging about gender-based advocacy?
For me, I don't know if either of you have read Dr. Rumi Balam's Tallest Poppy Syndrome. It's a brilliant piece of work. It is an international piece of research, but it is very much focused on Canada because she is Canadian, and it's through the Women of Influence organization in Ontario, where basically she talked to thousands and thousands of women around the idea of successful women who are objectively doing well in the workplace, who are maybe getting accolades or getting acknowledged out in the wider community, and how sometimes the, I would say, jealousy, sexism, and sometimes just insecurities being deflected are the 3 top reasons as to why a lot of times women who end up with having these kind of accolades, it's called the tallest poppy because they get cut because they're the ones who are up at the top. So it's the idea that, sometimes it's something that I have experienced that, if something happens in the community, all of a sudden these microaggressions come out from people that you just don't expect. And I remember I'm not going to name the place, but I worked for a workplace. Everything went well for the first 3 months. And all of a sudden I won a national award, and it was going to be in the Globe and Mail and all of these things. So I put this conflict of interest agreement in just to say, hey, it's going to be mentioned. Yeah, it's not about you, but it's going to be mentioned. Very much easy peasy protocol. I CC'd the bosses. And that was my mistake, because one of those people was very upset that I had won this award, and for some reason thought that I wanted to take their job, and started talking about me behind my back and setting me up for these things where they would make me a committee lead and then book meetings over mine and then ask me why do I not have any work done, or they would say I speak too much and that it's making other people intimidated, so I'd speak less in the next meeting and they'd call me out for being disengaged. And it was just this repeating cycle. And when I called it out, or called them in rather, and said, this is hurtful, I want to resolve this because I'm doing well here. I was also told that my metrics were too high and I was setting other people up for failure, so to work less. And they looked at me and said, do you ever think you're too much sometimes? And I walked out. And they lost one of their highest producing employees because of something so silly. And to me, I don't want to be the smartest person or the most accomplished person in the room. I'm not right now. If I'm in a room where I'm the smartest, I'm in the wrong room. If I see someone who's doing something cool, I want to pick their brain, get to know them, talk about them in the rooms they're not in. And the perpetrator within the tall poppy syndrome study is equally men and women. In my case, it was a man and a woman. And, this is just a way that really holds ambitious women back from keeping going. And I remember I was once out with this, another feminist powerhouse who won a different national award, and we ran into a third feminist powerhouse on the street, and she was like, congrats on that national award. Just thanks, it just makes me more unemployable now. And we were like, ha ha ha, and walked away. But I've always thought about it since, is that, we work so hard to break these stigmas and stereotypes and lift people up only to be pushed down again. And there's a lot of work, and it goes back to that bias training and to understanding your why and owning your own value and backstory, and understanding that someone else's success isn't really going to knock down your own. And I find that was the biggest challenge for me, was the tallest poppy syndrome.
I say the tallest poppy syndrome. And who wrote it again?
Dr. Ramit Balam.
And I also think that that's probably one of the biggest challenges when you're advocating for the value of GBA plus, because a lot of people are, perceive GBA plus to be, a system or a process that is helping people gain more advantage over someone else. And across a lot of organizations, it's really hard to erode that scarcity mentality, that if you're giving someone else a leg up or you're giving someone else an opportunity, then that means that you have less of an opportunity or your piece of the pie is smaller. But that's the wrong way to look at it. And a lot of people sometimes have their guard up in terms of introducing those types of policies, because I find in a lot of my conversations with GBA plus is some individuals bring up the aspect of merit, being like, well, wouldn't you want the best person, given this opportunity or, being involved in this decision making, regardless of their identity or gender? Which, yes, absolutely, but, that argument shouldn't exist in a vacuum. It's like, is the reason why you think that most of the people who are worthy of this opportunity, for example, are older males or older, white females? So when you approach gender-based analysis plus, it can sometimes be difficult to communicate the value that it's actually going to be expanding the pie for everyone, and it's going to the economic and social benefits of baking in these perspectives on how you recruit, retain, design policies is super important to help quell people's fears that, are we going to be getting the best people for this? Yes, you are, absolutely, because this just helps you find the best people.
Exactly.
It doesn't help you give someone an opportunity who may not be qualified. So, communicating the value and the outcomes of GBA plus is, it can be tricky sometimes.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of both of what you just said, but last year I had the opportunity to hear Greg Roberts speak about his kind of journey throughout his career. I was laughing through the whole thing. It was actually very funny. It was at St. John's Board of Trade Business Boot Camp last year. Shout out to them for that amazing event, which this week they had another one, and it was awesome too. And I also, a couple weeks after that last year, got the opportunity to hear Leah Hextall speak at the Energy NL conference about allyship. Leah was, I believe this was right, the first female play-by-play broadcaster with the NHL, and she faces immense abuse online to this day, even though she's had years of experience, and is absolutely amazing. And I guess, what's my point? My point is around allyship and not creating those kind of false barriers. And once you know more about GBA plus, diversity, inclusion, equity, accessibility, those barriers just kind of fall away, is what I've kind of experienced. And hearing those people talk about, giving people opportunities. Greg's been amazing with the growth of the franchises of Mary Brown's, and there's actually a lot of new Canadians who end up being franchisees of that organization. And Leah talks about allyship, and she spoke directly to the males in the room at the Energy NL conference about supporting women and how that has helped her throughout her career. It's just very impactful. And my last note, have you ever seen that cartoon of the folks trying to watch a baseball game.
Yeah.
And there's equity where everyone has the same box, and some people can see over the fence and see the baseball game. And then there's another picture next to it, and it's inclusion, I believe, is under that one. And everyone has a box that is of appropriate height to let them see over the fence. Saw another version of that. I think it was a couple years ago now, but I love it. Everybody's sat at the baseball game. They're not watching from outside of the fence.
Yeah.
They're part of the game. They're not just able to watch it from afar together. They're there, and they're all participating kind of together. That was an impactful cartoon.
Yeah.
Cartoon I came across on the Google, but I use it in training presentations all the time, and it just kind of clicks with people, that visual and that kind of understanding, which has been awesome. My last question for you guys this morning: what brings you the most joy from what you do in your life, professionally, personally, business, not-for-profit, community work? What is your favorite thing about that?
Seeing others who've gone through programming that I've been able to facilitate succeed, and succeed, like, that's very subjective. That doesn't mean run and win, get a good job. It means finding more confidence and having more knowledge to make decisions that are going to impact them personally, professionally, community-wise. So I would say that is the ultimate thing for me. So it's like a dream that I get to just teach women how to run for politics for a living.
Feels really good.
It does.
Doesn't it?
And as an aside, I will say that, when you elect more women, women and people of color are known for passing more robust legislation more often than male counterparts. They actually have more labor-focused legislation passed that evens the playing field. They're better with international relations. And this comes from a study from the World Institute of Women's Leadership. They actually conglomerated over 500 pieces of academic and institutional research that showed that when you have women in government, they will actually make the labor force better. And if we can elect more women to get more legislation passed, if we were able to open up the barriers and have full women's participation, whether that's through pay transparency, pay equity, whether that's through helping with childcare and parental leave and flexible workspaces, our world's GDP would immediately increase by approximately 20%. So there is good business sense to electing women, to hiring women and mentoring and lifting them up. And that's why it's so important. And that's not saying don't elect men. We need men, we need women, we need diverse perspectives, gender diversity. And when we have all those perspectives at the table for policies and corporations and governments, the better and the more robust and inclusive our programming and funding policies will be.
Love it. Great work.
Like the biggest source of joy in doing community work or advocacy work is obviously the dismantling of the gatekeeping of knowledge. And that has been one of the most fulfilling aspects of becoming involved with like-minded community people or community initiatives. So there are lots of times where powerful or very helpful information is often contained within organizations.
Yes.
And it's really difficult to access either those people who have that knowledge or that knowledge from the outside. And it can also be very intimidating to approach these different organizations. So whether it's, a business or a not-for-profit group or even a political party, for example, unless you have some sort of connection with them, it can be difficult to establish that relationship or flow of opportunity. And so what I have found is that when you were in the community and advocacy space, and if you have the courage to tell your own story or communicate the barriers that you've personally experienced, and you start to empower other people to share their stories and experiences as well. And then people realize, okay, so, this is a lot more common than I thought. Then you're bringing issues to the forefront. And then that helps mobilize support for that particular experience because people don't know what they don't know.
Exactly.
And it's very rewarding to have people who will say, after the fact, I didn't even know that that particular dynamic existed here regarding childcare or gender-based violence or hiring policies or what have you, because a lot of the times when you open up access to information, that helps organizations, it helps people, it helps governments make better decisions. And better decision making is why we are involved with stuff.
And I think we talked about informed decision making early on when we started our chat here today. So this is my head is just like spinning. I would love to keep talking to you. We would be here all weekend, I think. Any final thoughts on anything we've discussed this morning?
I will say, I guess going back to the piece around challenges, tall poppy syndrome, if you find yourself in that situation, this is more advice for the folks who are in it. Know that, yes, we need to be at the tables where decisions are being made, but there are many tables where decisions are being made. And if every table you go to, it's going to be a little wobbly. And you have to assess, is that something that you can fix? Is it worth fixing? But if it's not going to help your mental health and well-being, you won't be able to show up as your best self to do the work that you want to do. So sometimes it means that you leave that table to find a better one. Sometimes it means burning that table to the ground and making it, fertilization for something better. So
that was a metaphorical burn the table.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I won't burn this table.
That is great advice.
And I think that's super important. And I feel for women and marginalized groups in particular, there is this often pressing need to feel like you can do it all. You can inflict change wherever you want. And I think you can't be all things to all people, and you do have to give yourself a level of protection to say, is this good for me? Is this good for my community? And can I affect change in a different way, in a different space? And that doesn't mean that you accept defeat. It means that you are just reorganizing your goals, and you can affect change in a different way. And I think, in the GBA Plus, in the community advocacy space, in private corporations where you are interested in, creating these better cultures, you can do it one bite at a time, or you can burn it down. But make those decisions. Like, be a little selfish, and you can put your own well-being at the center.
Absolutely.
Good. That is awesome. Well, I would like to thank both of you for joining me here this morning. I am super excited to watch both of you continue to affect change and also continue to affect change together. And I sound like a broken record oftentimes when I say this often. Teamwork makes the dream work.
True.
No one's out there by themselves. There's a whole world of people out there all, trying to live our best lives. So don't give up, don't get discouraged. That's my advice. We'll leave it on that.
I love it.
And go for it.
Do it.
Okay.
Do it. Never a good time, always a good idea. That's my motto.
Never a good time, always a good idea. Yep.
And if you feel that doubt, message one of us. We're all on LinkedIn. We're chronically online girlies.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining and watching Gale Force Wins this morning. And we will see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to Gale Force Wins. That's Gale Force Wins, WINS.com.